What's up guys, welcome back to the channel. So today we're going to be hopping into one of the best Sorceress builds for Frozen Orb in Season 4. So starting right off, let's go ahead and go over one of the biggest updated changes, which is actually a brand new unique item that actually gives you a huge amount of extra bonus Frozen Orbs. The unique is called Fractured Winterglass. If you do not have this build will not function properly. I highly recommend you guys to check out my leveling build, which I will have linked down below. But basically what this does is allows us to have the ability to throw out Frozen Orb, and when it explodes, there's a chance it'll spawn a Conjuration. That's kind of like a summon. That's the Hydra, that's the little lightning spear, or it's going to be those little ice blades. When those hit enemies, there's a chance that they will summon another Frozen Orb. So that's how we get a bunch of different Frozen Orbs just flying all around. This item is actually acquired by doing Lord Zir. So if you need to acquire the blood and go do Lord Zir, and you're going to need to acquire this item for this build. If you do not have this item, this build does not function as it should. But you can still kind of try to play Frozen Orb, but it's not nearly as good as it can be. You're better off leveling up with Inferno or Fireball. But let's go ahead and get started with some of the newer updated changes, as I have updated the build to kind of fit the more recent update. Some things have been updated, and these were not actually mentioned in the patch notes, and that is that they removed specifically a lot of different rolls on certain things. They rolled lower in other areas. They actually deleted attack speed on a lot of the weapons, with the exception of some of the uniques. So for starters, let's go ahead and go over some sort of breakpoints that you do need to kind of look out for while you are making this build. So ideally, you do want to try to have high crit chance in any Diablo build. Ideally, with this build, you want to try to hit a mana pool that is going to be able to cast at least 2 casts of Frozen Orb while still maintaining 100 or more mana. And that is actually very important to actually maintain crit, because you can't roll crit on your amulet because you are locked to the Fractured Winterglass. So to kind of give you guys an explanation of what you should try to look for, is you'll see that on my mana cost, we're going to have 33 mana cost. 33 times 2 is 66, so that mana pool over here without a potion is at 167. So if you want to pop a potion to do this, it's totally fine, because now in Season 4, Elixir of Resourcefulness is actually really easy to acquire. But basically, just be able to have 2 casts that you can actually expend, and you're still over 100 mana. And with the Paragon Board, we will get extra mana, but you can either get a greater affix in your helm or in your offhand to try to meet these requirements. Or, again, you can just pop a potion. It's up to you. Because now, with attack speed not being on a lot of the rolls, it makes it a little bit harder to min-max in this build to reach that 100% attack speed cap. On top of that, there are other breakpoints to go ahead and consider. One of them is going to be specifically hitting 440 dexterity. If you copy this build exactly, you will hit it. But you do need to copy this absolutely perfect in the Paragon Board, as well as reach those nodes of getting the increased size of the glyphs, as well as getting the glyphs maxed out to reach these numbers, because they are quite high for most builds unless you copy it exactly. So with one of the rare nodes that we're going to be taking here, we get a huge amount of damage reduction. You guys can see it's 27% damage reduction from chilled enemies. This is massive. And then there's another node that you can get, which is called Polar Rime, which is going to give you a huge amount of damage. It's 30 damage to chilled enemies, and that requires 440 willpower. And if you copy this exactly, these stats will be met. Another thing that you do want to hit, and this is something that you're going to have to roll on at least one piece of gear, and that is to get cold damage with a tempering mod. So you'll see over here, it is kind of flexible on where you can get it, although I will recommend the gloves. And the reason why you need to hit 300% cold damage and non-physical counts as cold is you will be able to reach the Frigid Fate's cap, which is going to be 30x multiplicative damage. So those are the important numbers to hit, and I want to go over kind of like the update to this build, as we have min-maxed it much harder. So now that the breakpoint numbers are out of the way, let's go ahead and hop into what you need as far as the gear and the skills that you're going to be using. So for starters, the first skill over here, Hydra, you are going to be able to spam it sometimes when there's a boss that goes into a phase where like you can't damage it, or if you're just like waiting for something to spawn in, like the world boss takes a second. There's a lot of bosses in general where they kind of take a second to pop out. So casting 2 Hydras down is really great, because that's going to be how we are going to be dealing damage. The more amount of Conjurations we have is our source of major damage. Even though the Conjurations do shoot out more Frozen Orbs, a big portion of our damage is actually going to be from the skill tree, and how many Conjurations we have equals more damage. So just throwing out Hydras is totally fine. I usually just do it while I'm kind of waiting for something, but pretty much you don't really need to activate it. They will spawn in automatically, but again, there's really not a skill that you have to play right here. So Hydra is optional. The other skill, obviously Frozen Orb, it's a Frozen Orb build, so you just spam this and you'll be good to go. And then defensively, you can use Flame Shield as well as Ice Armor when anything goes wrong, but Ice Armor actually got changed in Season 4 and did receive a buff to actually give you some sort of damage if you want to take it, or you can have extra cooldown reduction on it. And then I really like Frost Nova. There is a newer change with Frost Nova that can give you dodge, which will also give you mana. This build will have 100% uptime on mana for the most part. There are certain times where if there's nothing there and you're spamming Frozen Orb, well, you're not going to have infinite mana. But pretty much the build will have infinite mana 99% of the time. The one time that it won't have is because the boss goes into a phase where it like disappears for a second. There's a couple unique bosses that do it, or they're in a phase where you can't attack it and you're just shooting Frozen Orbs. But as long as you're hitting targets, this build will have infinite mana. You'll see my mana is basically at cap the whole entire time, with the exception of if it's not hitting targets. And then with Teleport over here, it's just used for mobility, and for the enchantments, Frozen Orb, so we get more Frozen Orbs, and then we have Firebolt to apply a burn to the enemy, which is going to activate some of our other things. There is another build that I do plan to upload later, and that is going to be with Esu's. It's more of a min-maxer like build, but keep in mind that is going to be optional, but I will be dropping multiple variations of the Frozen Orb build, as it's pretty much the best build in the game, and there are multiple different ways to play it. The only other exception that would be like one of the best Sorcerer builds is the Frosty Strides, but that is a very difficult build to play, and we're probably only looking at like the top 1% of players even bothering building it, because it requires your HP to be at a certain amount, and you can't go over it, because if you go over it, the build completely breaks. So for starters, as far as the helmet goes, Ever Living Aspect is one of the best ones. It gives you the most amount of damage reduction possible, and what you do want to try to get is maximum resource on this. It's a really good stat to go ahead and grab, because, well, it's going to allow you to again reach that threshold where you can cast multiple Frozen Orbs and still maintain above 100, because this is how we're going to essentially, in the far end of the game, once we get all of our rolls to be perfect, we will have a little bit easier time of achieving 100% crit with this build. And then as far as the other aspect, Juggernaut's aspect is great. We can also look at mana per second, so we don't have resource problems. Mana per second can be in the helmet as well, or cooldown reduction. It's up to you. Maybe you got a greater affix, and then you only need really 1 mana per second in one of the slots. And then as far as our gloves here, we're running the Elementalist aspect over here. So this is why we need to be at 100 or more. So we can't put this on an amulet. You could arguably put this on a two-hander and just have 80% crit with that, and then you have real easy 100% crit, but then you're going to lose out on some sort of multiplier. So it's better to get crit in other places, but it's up to you on how you want to go for it. I like to not run a staff, because staff gives you extra damage to crowd controlled, whereas the weapon in the wand department, as well as running a offhand, you will have the ability to get cooldown reduction as well as lucky hit chance. And lucky hit chance is tied to how the Fractured Winter class works, because it has a lucky hit chance. This doesn't mean you have a 70% chance. It's basically just like a very low chance. It depends on what skill is actually activating, but at the end of the day, it's such a low lucky hit chance that you want as much lucky hit as you possibly can get, as that is tied to your build. And then Crowded Sage is actually a really excellent one over here, or you can run the run that gives you extra fortification, whatever one rolls better, but getting extra dodge is actually a great source of survivability in this season, especially if you are interested in pushing higher in the pit. Next up, as far as the boots go, you can run a few different things here. Slaughter is great for movement speed, and especially in town, because a lot of time spent in Diablo is walking from point to point B, but you can run the one that applies daze, and you do more damage to daze targets if you do want to get more damage, if you're really looking to push higher in the pit. But I think Aspect of Slaughter is going to be kind of everyone's favorite, just because moving is key in Diablo. Next up, we have Accelerating Aspect over here, where it makes it so crit strikes with her core skills increases her attack speed. This is a major change. They did not add attack speed as something that you can roll on an item, so therefore you can get int, max life, vulnerable damage, anything really here in terms of damage for the other one. But getting int in terms of your main stat is kind of like the more important stat to get on your weapon now, as attack speed does not roll. Getting any percent chance to get resource is fine too, but resource cost reduction is valued over the chance to restore, because you're going to have a lot of mana regen with this build. I mean, look at the mana. I mean, it just goes right back up really fast, because we have a lot of different conjurations. But as far as the amulet, obviously Fractured Winterglass, which we already went over, the effect of it, that's what you need in the amulet. And then Aspect of Frozen Memories can really help out with mana as well, because what happens is on our passive, Avalanche is going to apply an additional cast, which basically makes the thing free, and we have a giant multiplier on it. But ideally, what you want to try to get in a lot of areas is specifically crit strike chance as well as attack speed. And because Sorceress doesn't have a good source of vulnerability other than Frost Nova, well, having this mod, Lucky Hit, chance to make enemies vulnerable is excellent. You can also just roll a Cursed Touch. That is another thing if you happen to not have that roll on a ring, as it's not one of the most common things to roll. You can go ahead and get that as well. And then this is a really easy, unique item to get, which is Tall Rosh's Iridescent Loop. It's dropped, I think, like 10 plus times at this point when my character was leveling up to 100. I had a bunch of these, and I was giving them away, so it's a really common drop. But if you don't get it, don't worry. You can throw on, like, Swell or any other, like, thing that gives you bonus damage. Whatever you want to run is totally fine. Heck, I was even thinking about dropping this and just running Asus. I'll also make a dedicated video if anyone wants to learn the snapshotting, because you technically can get all of the elements with this, because you can get Lucky Hit chance to apply Shadow or Poison, but it is kind of tedious. But I'm going to reserve that for a dedicated video, because that's like for a 1%er sort of a thing. But there is snapshotting that can exist with Tall Rosh's, and at that point, it is the best ring in the entire game by a long shot. But most people don't want to do weapon swaps and stuff, and I totally get that. And then we have the aspect of the Frozen Orbit. So this makes it so Frozen Orb explodes multiple times. Remember, every single time it explodes, we will be getting more conjurations. And then what we want to temper on most of the pieces of gear, now that we went over the aspects over here, let's go over the tempering after the gems. The gems are pretty much every single same Diablo build. So you throw in the emeralds in the weapons, rubies in the armor, and then in the jewelry department, you can just throw in diamonds because we have juggernauts over here. So as far as in the tempering slot, just max life everywhere. I just like running juggernaut, then that way it deals with all of it, then I can just roll max life. There are other builds that tell you to go ahead and roll armor, but that requires you to get armor several times, and that's not as easy because this allows more flexibility to get maximum life or dodge chance, and both of those would be arguably good, and it allows for a lot more flexibility, and I think it's objectively kind of better anyways. But nonetheless, cooldown reduction is great to go ahead and get. There really isn't anything super important to mention, but when you do temper on your piece of gear, that chance to freeze could be good because you will do more damage to frozen targets. So getting that as the utility on a lot of the pieces of gear is fine, or you can get Frost Nova size, doesn't really matter too much at the end of the day. But on the weapons, this is actually the important part. You want to get weapon chance for frozen or projectiles to cast twice. That's the most important thing. The other thing that you can get is Natural Finesse here actually has a very high chance to roll something good. Now, if you do the cold one or the frost one, you have extra cold damage, which is still great, and it goes up by 10%. However, there are more things in that category, and it seems like that weighted roll, for whatever reason, it just always goes to ice spikes. We don't have the official data set, but a weighted roll means that it has a higher chance to roll on ice spikes or another skill versus the flat cold damage, which is the one that you want. So we don't know what those ones are, but technically it is easier to just get like the damage to distance or regular damage versus the other one. Well, there's a lot more that have risk, because if you get ice spike damage, that doesn't really help your build at all. As far as the other ring goes, again, getting that Lucky Hit chance to make enemies vulnerable and getting attack speed is good. So another thing with Tall Rosh is that unfortunately it does not have attack speed, and most people will not reach the attack speed cap in a lot of builds, with the exception of maybe the Rogue, because there's a lot of easier ways to get it, because you have Cutthroat attack speed as one of the temper mods. But as far as the other offhand over here, again, you do want that chance for frozen or projectiles to cast twice. You can get resource cost reduction, you can get crit strike chance, you can get cooldown reduction, you can get Lucky Hit chance, any combination. The goal is to ideally reach 100% crit. With this build. You already get easily with the Elementals aspect if it does roll good, and this is again an endgame build. You'll eventually get it though. You get 40 here, you get 5 with your base character stats, and you can get about 7% easily with just the natural dexterity. So you already have 50% of it covered, and then you're really just looking at getting crit chance on your ring as well as on your offhand and in your weapon department, or I'm sorry, your glove department. On the weapon, it does not roll crit. You cannot roll crit strike chance. There are some uniques that can give you that in the game, like on Rogue, but the attack speed no longer rolls here, so you do need to try to look out for attack speed and try to ideally get those greater affixed, or if you get crit strike chance greater affixed, that can be okay as well. Ideally, again, your whole goal is to reach 100% crit. So now that we went over the aspects as well as like more of the important tempers, let's go ahead and go over the skill tree. So this is basically the skill tree. If you don't have a source of vulnerability, you do need to apply vulnerability somehow in any build. So Greater Frozen Orb, if you need to, that's totally fine as well. And then just getting extra mana, because we want to be at, again, over 100 mana every single time we cast our skill, so we have 100% crit. Otherwise, we're going to lose out on damage. Then we have Shimmering Teleport over here, and this is one of the newer things in Season 4, which is with the Mystical Armor. So while Ice Armor is active, we get to chill close enemies and deal increased damage to frozen enemies. There is another thing that is brand new here, and that is with Frost Nova. So with Frost Nova, with Shimmering Frost Nova, it's going to grant us extra amount of dodge per enemy hit with the Nova. And then we can go up to 15%, or if we hit a boss, we get the maximum amount, and it also gives us extra resource. We don't really need this for the resource, we're just using it for 15% chance to dodge. That is huge. That is literally 3 rolls on an item, because on average it'll give you about 5%. This is massive when you hit a boss, and it is like objectively one of the better things that you can actually throw in. Heck, and some boss fights, not running Firebolt is fine, and the reason why is because your Hydra can actually apply the burn when you put another point into it. It's up to you. If you want to go ahead and run the Summon Hydra, you can drop the other enchantment and then run the other thing. It's going to give you a massive amount of bonus stats over there. You're just going to be able to melt things very, very fast. Again, once it applies the burn, you'll get the extra bonuses that we'll talk about here. So pretty much giving us a bunch of damage reduction over here. And this is what gives us a lot of damage here. So with the Fractured Winterglass, this over here is our main source of bonuses. So you want the Conjuration Mastery to roll like greater affix ideally. So you get extra damage, you get extra movement speed, and mana regen for each active conjuration. So every little pet that you have that gets summoned, that's how you get a lot of damage with this build. And that's how I'm moving super fast and have no mana problems. And then over here, if you want to remove Snap Freeze and put it into something else, that's fine. But I like it. It just lets you freeze enemies. When the enemy's frozen, you are going to be able to deal more damage to frozen enemies. So I like it for that reason. There is another build, by the way, with Ice Heart Breos, but I'm going to reserve that for another one because it requires a bunch of different temper rolls, but it is arguably pretty dang good as well. There's just so many things that you can do with Frozen Orb. It's not like a very basic build. There are a lot of different variations, and I'll be covering them on the channel. So if you want different variations of how to play, yeah, we will be dropping them very soon. So then we have Frigid Breeze over here, so just more damage. All of these are really just like damage as well as extra mana. This is all Lucky Hit. Frozen Orb, by the way, has a pretty low Lucky Hit chance, but since it's popping multiple times and you're actually hitting the targets multiple times, it actually procs quite often. Don't expect it to be on the same level as, again, like something like Fireball, which can have like, on the higher end, once you get Lucky Hit, you can get like easily around 50-ish% lucky hit chance, while Frozen Orb is like 6 and 7 is considered kind of high end over here. And then for our key passive over here, we're running Avalanche. This allows us to make it so our Frost skills have a chance to make our next cast of Ice Shards, Frozen Orb, or Blizzard consume no mana, so it doesn't even cost mana, and it's going to deal way more damage. But it is actually doubled against vulnerable enemies, which is super easy because you'll just apply a vulnerability. You'll see, as long as I hit the target a couple times, it will be vulnerable, and that's how we actually apply vulnerability, is again with this stat on the ring. It's a lucky hit chance. So you can see the enemy will be vulnerable. As long as it like takes damage, you'll see it's kind of outlined in purple there. That's how we can indicate the enemy has actually been hit with vulnerability. So as far as the Paragon board, this is actually where it actually changed up quite a bit, as there has been more newer changes here. So starter board is going to be Elemental. This is like objectively one of the better ones to get because you get 15x multiplicative damage, and it boosts up what's called non-physical stats over here. So non-physical stats is actually resistances as well as damage that's considered non-physical damage. So the Sorceress with non-physical damage actually counts as poison and shadow damage. In Season 1, that's why the Malignant Heart actually had some crazy like bugs that you can do with it, especially with Rogue, because it was considered shadow damage with one of the Malignant Hearts. And then we're getting all of this extra non-physical damage, more non-physical damage. We're also running Unleash here because it grants 150% bonus to all magic nodes. One of the magic nodes is non-physical damage, doubling this up over here, getting another 10%. And that's going to give us a bunch of stats so we can reach some of the requirements that I was talking about before. Then we go to Control. Control is important here because Control allows us to grab these extra mana nodes. That's how I maintain a very high amount of mana and I don't dip down, because we don't want to dip down. Once we dip down, we start losing out on that 100% crit chance. And while I don't have everything perfect in the gameplay here, eventually we will get 100% crit. It's very easy to achieve with the Sorceress. And then over here, there's extra non-physical damage. Again, this will reach other numbers, which we'll mention here on one of the Paragon boards. And then over here we're playing control. So elemental summoner control. Later there is another build, and I know I'm mentioning a lot of other like ideas for this, but there are different ways to play the frozen orb. You can actually, if you have the Harlequin Crest, the Shaco, you can actually spec into conjurations and you can actually make them do a respectable amount of damage and get all these other cool effects, but you are going to be losing frozen orb damage unless you have that, because you can't really stretch all of your points here because there's just simply not enough points to go ahead and invest 5 points into all of the conjurations. But for the most part, it technically is pretty good for open world content and will clear things out faster. And for bosses, I mean, it is extra damage. I mean, you can get this up quite high because you can get all of your non-physical damage to be 300 apiece. And remember, for each one of the bonuses with fire, lightning, and cold, you can get over 50x multiplicative damage. Now, this only applies to the conjurations. And then you can run a different glyph, but we'll reserve that for a future video. I'm just giving you guys kind of a sneak peek at what I plan to do. And then after Elemental Summoner, we are going to be going up to Icefall and Winter. This is where it differs from a lot of the other builds. So this node is absolutely amazing. Your Frost skills deal X15 increased multiplicative damage to vulnerable enemies, and then this bonus is doubled if the enemy is frozen. Since we can temper on frozen and we are using a cold skill, it's going to freeze enemies eventually, and the Frost Nova instantly freezes enemies, unless of course it's a boss. Then you got to build up that stagger bar. Once the stagger bar is built up, they are considered chilled, slowed, stunned, immobilized. They're considered all of it. But basically we get a huge amount of bonus damage with this. That's one of the other changes. And remember how I mentioned that we need to specifically hit those numbers. On this, I know it doesn't show that we reach the willpower. We do reach the willpower, obviously, because I showed you guys some of these like pictures here. The reason why is when you get the bonus stats to the certain thing, like in over here, when you get the bonus to all the magic nodes, it may not register properly in here, but we do reach all of the nodes here. If not, well, if you copy the build exactly, you'll be fine. You don't even have to go for all stat items. That was a thing back in like the season 0, 1, 2, and 3 that you would have to actually go for. But now you don't need to go for it. You'll have it. Don't worry about it. And then as far as, you also get like points via the Lilith statues as well. But next up, after the fourth one, we're going to go back to Elemental Summoner, and our fifth one is going to be Frigid Fate, and we're going to be getting the node over here. So more damage, and this is how we're going to reach our cap. We get that non-physical damage, which counts cold. That way we get X30 multiplicative damage, and then we're going to get destruction. So this is why we really value crit. Every single Diablo build, for the most part, with the exception of some sort of thorns or some damage over time, you need crit damage in your build to actually deal good damage. I mean, it's just a huge, massive amount of bonus stats. So we want to get destruction over here, and then we're going to be moving down to Burning Instinct with Flame Feeder over here. And since we do burn all the targets, we get some damage reduction from enemies that are burning, and we also have some extra damage to burning enemies. This is not burn damage or damage over time, but it's just that if the enemy's burning, we get to deal more damage. And then we're also running Flame Feeder here. Now, there is an option here if you do want to play Control over this. Control deals 20x multiplicative damage if it is a frozen or stunned target. However, it does not work against some of the bosses unless you build up that stagger bar. So, objectively, this one is better for bosses in most situations unless you insta-stagger, which doesn't really happen unless you're playing some sort of Fist of Fate with maybe something that has crazy lucky hit chance with, like, again, Fireball has like crazy amounts of lucky hit. But this is going to be the Paragon board, and that's going to go ahead and wrap things up for the build. But if there's any questions, let me know down below. And if you're new here and do want to see the other variations, maybe with some Uber uniques, I do plan to go ahead and make those. But for the most part, I understand people don't really expect to get Uber uniques, but in this season, honestly, you guys can achieve an Uber unique, and that is because you are going to be able to get 3 Resplendent Sparks absolutely for free. So if you guys want to see the updated build with the Shaco, which I think a lot of people will be interested in getting, maybe for the very first time, you can make another build that gives you a little bit more damage and adds a lot more utility and a lot of cool stuff that we can do, but I'm going to reserve that for another video. So if you want to see that or any other more Diablo build guides or just more gaming stuff, subscribe, turn on the bell if it's your first time here. I'll catch you guys in the next video, and everything will be linked down below. In case I was too fast with anything, the planner will be linked.